If you listen carefully to the American mainstream media, you'll find out that there's an emerging food crisis.
And the world bracing for food shortages as the war in Ukraine rages on.
With Russia's invasion now sparking a global food crisis.
Still would face a rampant hunger crisis. As CNN's Kylie Atwood reports, the U.S. and others are sounding urgent alarms about how Russian forces are interfering with food shipments that keep hundreds of millions of people across the globe from starving.
New warning from President Zelensky about a looming food crisis facing the world. Ukraine's leader said in a video statement yesterday that millions of people could starve if Russia continues to block them from exporting wheat and grain to the rest of the world.
I say that job one in Ukraine right now is to open up the ports so Ukraine can export the food, and we should operate militarily to open up those ports.
But did you hear that?
Ukraine.
In Ukraine.
With Russia's invasion now,
Russian forces are...
Now ask yourself, is this the siren or the match?
Even prior to the invasion, global supplies were tight. We're seeing record high prices for a lot of commodities, and that's due to because of droughts around the world and other issues that drew down inventories and raised prices. Ukraine and Russia are major agricultural exporters. They account for about 30% of wheat traded in the world. In terms of corn and barley, another 20%, and sunflower oil over 75%. So these are major agricultural suppliers, and the disruption of those supplies is what's really sent prices skyrocketing over the last 3 weeks.
So if you're watching this video, it's likely that you've never had to worry about where your next meal was going to come from. And if you're like me, you probably haven't been staring at this problem long enough to make any really informed decisions. That said, that's probably not your fault, and that's because the world's actually been on autopilot for quite some time. Our fight against food scarcity has been so good that we actually had a goal to eradicate food hunger by 2030. That said, due to some of these pandemic woes in terms of the supply chain restrictions and constrictions and the tightening commodities market, and obviously the invasion of Ukraine from Russia, this has led to kind of an accelerated headwind, if you will, in terms of our fight against food scarcity. So today I want to look at whether or not this will affect Main Street America and kind of talk you through kind of how we got here. This is a chart showing the price of wheat plus corn plus oats as traded on the futures market. So from the starting point of the pandemic in March right here, the price has increased well over 100%. And to make things worse, from the start of the Russian invasion in Ukraine, the price of this basket of commodities has increased an additional 16%, as seen here. So obviously this is an extremely complex and adaptive system, but that said, let's go ahead and break down a basic roadmap and kind of try to oversimplify this incredibly complex system to better understand how we got to where we're at. So the first thing I want to do is draw your attention to inputs. And so there are 5 categories here that we are kind of breaking this down into, and 2 of which we have no control over, and that would be environmental and COVID-19. And so the other 3, economics, war, and policy, I do think we have levers or instruments of control here. And so we do have some agency in terms of the way that we can define this and the way that we can solve for these outputs. So on the far right, we have outputs. So for instance, here, world, and here, Sri Lanka, the country. But let's go ahead and back up and talk about pre-crisis. So I do want to draw your attention to pre-crisis. And I've just outlined 4 countries that were already in a bad place before the kind of match that is the Ukraine war. And that was Afghanistan, East Africa, Yemen, and Chile. And so as we approach this food crisis and the war in the Ukraine happens, we do get a couple things that spiral out of control. So let's go ahead and talk about this. First, let's talk about the economic window. And so when we talk about economics, there's kind of 2 things that we can do here. So right now, because of quantitative easing, that led to inflation. And inflation makes the cost of goods cost more, of course, and it decreases our purchasing power. This obviously affects the world. Now, what can we do about this? Obviously, the world has flipped on its head, and now we're going through what they call QT, which is quantitative tightening, which should help affect the markets and should create what they call demand destruction. And demand destruction itself should lead to lower prices for things like commodities. So another thing to think about when we talk about economics is GDP contraction. So essentially all this means is that, the countries in the world have been less productive due to the pandemic, due to lockdowns, due to supply constraints. And so this is another thing to think about, but one country that it hit very hard is Sri Lanka. So that's a deep dive in itself, but just know that there are countries that have been massively affected by this. So now I want to talk about the environmental factors, and this is really important because this is constant and persistent. But this is the one big key input that set the table or set the stage for not only the pandemic, but then follow on the match that is the Ukraine to kind of light that fire. But environmentally, we've been dealing with extreme heat. That's in Europe, North America, India, and Pakistan. And so the other thing in terms of this year and in terms of the crop yields itself was flooding, and that happened in Australia and South America as well. And then obviously we have drought, which happens yearly, but it has been very severe in the following countries: Iraq, Somalia, and Canada. So as we set the table and we have these economic conditions and we have these environmental conditions, so the next input here is COVID-19. And really what that did was kind of deteriorate the supply chains, both in terms of efficacy and cost. And so because of this, the world has suffered. And we'll go ahead and move on off of that. So now let's go ahead and talk about the elephant in the room, and that's the war in Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine, obviously because of how instrumental Russia and Ukraine were on the stage when it comes to wheat production and natural gas, this created a commodity price surge here. And we're going to talk about two specific things here, but essentially wheat, which led to a shortage in Egypt, and then natural gas, which leads to an underproduction of fertilizer, which obviously affects the world.
And on top of it, it comes fertilizer. Russia is a major producer of fertilizers, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash, and also the natural gas that is used to produce nitrogen fertilizer in Europe. 40% of the gas comes from Russia. And when we know that half of the world's population gets its food because of mineral fertilizer, it all adds up to a very, very difficult situation.
So the final thing I want to talk about here is policy, and I'm going to paint with an extremely broad brush here and talk about just the export bans. We're going to talk about some of the other policy measures and effects that are in place right now that are dealing with the crisis. But right now, I just want to showcase how many countries there are here that have export bans. So as I finish out this video, it looks like we have some good news. So first and foremost, the price of wheat has come down. It looks like the futures market has showed about a 10% decrease in the last 3 days of wheat prices. So if we can stabilize here or continue to sell off, that would lead to a much more efficient grain market. Additionally, according to most estimates, the Ukraine has been able to get about 80% of their crop into the ground. This should lead to a future yield that is a lot better than what it was expected. That said, also because of their resilience, they've been looking at ways to get their wheat and grains out of Ukraine into the markets without using the Black Sea. And finally, it looks like the numbers coming out of China are going to be much better than expected. According to the Ministry of Agriculture in China, it looks like the crop yields will be just fine next year. So in closing, I don't think we're quite out of the woods yet. And that's because if you think that the efficient markets theory works here, then we're looking at a lot of volatility, a lot of sensitivity. And given that, it just doesn't look like it's over yet. We can definitely see a marked increase in wheat prices here, and that's because of war. War is just one of those intangibles that you can't account for. Anything and everything can happen. So let's also not forget that China just came out of lockdowns. So based on this and based on the precarious nature of the market itself, I do think that we have a ways to go. But that said, if the world decides that it needs to work together and wants to work together, we'll solve this. And that's always been the case. My name is Kenny. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.